Welcome back to the Deal Mastery Insider. Today, we're going to talk about net working capital. This is a question I get asked about a lot. It's a little bit of a complex topic, but it's also one that's really important, and it's not as confusing as it sounds. And so I wanted to unpack it for just a couple minutes and give you a sense of how I think about it and how you can apply it when you're looking at deals. Important disclaimer, obviously this isn't legal or financial advice. You need to do your own homework when you're looking at acquisitions. There's a substantial risk of loss or financial downside. Just make sure you're paying attention to this stuff. This is really illustrative to show you how to think about it, but you need to do your own homework and hire your own experts. So how do we calculate working capital? Well, there's two big puzzle pieces. What is net working capital, right? The easiest way to think about it, and a lot of times cash on the balance sheet at close is another type of working capital that you'll sometimes hear people reference. That is not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the calculation of something called net working capital, which are basically the current assets that you need to generate the earnings that the business produces or the business that you're buying produces, right? And I'm of the opinion that working capital should pretty much always be included in the purchase price of a business. And if it's not, then that should substantially penalize the business's purchase. And in a lot of cases, it's like buying half of a business. If you're not buying the assets that are needed on an ongoing basis to conduct the business, then are you really buying the machine that generates the earnings, right? So we'll talk about that more in a second. Typically, working capital also excludes cash and any long-term debts. So what is the working capital calculation? The easiest way to think about it is it's current assets minus current liabilities. And sometimes you'll get some noise in there, but 90+% of the time, you'll get almost to the finish line with a working capital calculation with really three things, which is accounts receivable plus inventory, technically plus other current assets, so a lot of times that's nothing or it's immaterial, minus accounts payable, right? Plus also minus other current liabilities, which again, a lot of cases is nothing or it's de minimis, not really important. The main formula here is accounts receivable plus inventory less accounts payable. That'll get you 95% of the way there in most working capital calculations. Sometimes you'll have other current assets or other current liabilities that also factor in, but the vast majority of the time, this is really the crux of the calculation. So I like to use this analogy of the box, right? So if you're buying a black box that generates X amount of EBITDA, you need all of the pieces for that box to generate it. And working capital is one of those pieces, right? So if I'm paying 5 times EBITDA to purchase a company, I'm assuming I'm purchasing that company that produces that much EBITDA. And if I buy a business that can't do that because it doesn't have any inventory or other various items, then I'm not really getting the whole thing. And so working capital is a really important concept. Sometimes buyers will get the idea, sometimes sellers will get the idea that, hey, this is my inventory that I bought and I want to keep it, right? And there's potential solutions for that. But the short version of the story is it's really the business's asset. And if it's needed to continue to conduct the business, then it's really part of the purchase in the vast, vast majority of cases. And you'll see the same thing with receivables sometimes. But again, the vast majority of the time, it's a necessary piece of what you're buying. It's like buying a bike without any tires. If it can't go anywhere, then you didn't really buy the whole bicycle, right? And so why is this so important? I think this is really critical to think about and understand, which is why do you need to have a working capital calculation in the purchase of a business? And there's really three big reasons. So if we start with the current assets side of the balance sheet, if we just look at accounts receivable, if we didn't describe or determine or define a peg that the working capital, the amounts of accounts receivable that's delivered upon the sale of the business, the seller could, before the business is sold, collect all of the receivables and starve the business for months of revenue, right? So depending on the average accounts receivable days or AR days of the business that you're buying, if it's 60 days, let's say, if the seller goes to their customer and say, hey, I'll give you a 50% discount if you pay all of your accounts receivables by the 31st of this month, right? And the customers go, great, okay, boom. They pay everything. And then the seller turns a business over to you with 0 accounts receivable, and it has a 60-day accounts receivable days on average, or the 60-day payment terms with their customers, then you're going to get a business that has 0 revenue for the next 60 days, putting you in a massively punitive position. You're going to have to sink a ton of capital in that business. The business might even fold out of the gate because it doesn't have any revenue coming in. And the peg discourages or prevents sellers from starving the business for months worth of revenue upon the purchase. Similarly, a nefarious seller could do the same thing with the inventory, right? They could basically sell all the inventory at a huge discount right before the business is sold, and then they deliver the business to a buyer with no inventory, and the buyer needs to go spend $500,000 on inventory just to fulfill the existing orders that are coming in, right? And so it could add, or it could be millions of dollars of inventory, depending on the size of the company, could add a hugely punitive additional capital expenditure to the business purchase. And if you buy a business with no inventory and it can't fulfill on its orders, then you didn't actually buy the business that you were purchasing, right? You just bought part of a business, but you can't fulfill it without sinking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into the business on top of that. So that's how it works on the asset side. The PEG, or the working capital calculation, basically prevents the seller from looting the business of its assets and then delivering something to the buyer that doesn't really have what it needs to keep conducting business. You can think about the same thing on the accounts payable side of things. If you were a nefarious seller, you could, and you don't have a net working capital PEG, what you could do is basically just accumulate all your bills. Don't pay anything for months and months and months, and tell your vendors, yeah, hey, I'm going to pay you next month. I promise, just tight cash window, whatever. And then you sell the business and deliver the buyer a business with 6 months of outstanding unpaid invoices, and all of their vendors clamoring and banging on the door saying, hey, if you don't pay me right now, I'm going to shut off your service. Suddenly they could have 6 months of operating expenses that have to go out the door the day of closing, or they're out of business, putting the business again in a massively precarious or dangerous position. That's why it's so critical to have current liabilities as part of the calculation. And you basically look at the relationship between the AR and the inventory that are needed to operate and the normal amount of payables that the business has. And you say, hey, as long as this relationship is kind of in balance when we buy the business, everybody's happy. But if there's a massive imbalance one way or the other, then we need to figure that out, usually with a purchase price adjustment. So how do we calculate that? I like to look at the last 2 or 3 years of AR, inventory, and AP, and look at the relationship, whether it's adjusted from a seasonal standpoint. I look at the high, I look at the low, look at the average, and try to just get a sense of that dynamic. So in this case, this is a business just looking at 2 years, and it's on a 7-month time horizon in this case, because I think we're looking at a closing in September or October. You can see for 2022, the average working capital was just over $1 million, which was about $1 million of AR, $100K or so of inventory, and about $100K of AP, right? So 1.1 of assets minus $100K of liabilities is about $100K. But that changes pretty substantially, right? So from a low of $745K in September to a high of $1.3 million in March, there's a pretty big swing there. It's about $500,000. Well, depending on how you're capitalizing the purchase of that company, that could be pretty punitive or painful if you agree to a $750,000 number, and then you need to put another $1 million into additional inventory and paying your bills while you're floating a bunch of receivables for months and months and months. So it's really important to define that PEG. And maybe you don't look at the high, maybe you don't look at the low, but making an informed decision about this balance is really critical. And similarly, you can see just the prior year gives you some more context. So, the average was just a little lower. It shows basically that the business is growing. The low was a little bit lower. The high was actually higher, which is interesting, right? And you want to unpack why that was the case. But this is the framework that I'll typically use to get to a number that I feel like is a safe working capital number. As the buyer of a business, you typically want that number to be as high as possible. As the seller, you want it to be lower, but most reasonable parties can kind of get to a middle ground that works for everyone. The last thing I'll show you is just, this is an example. Again, this isn't legal advice. I'm not an attorney. This is just an example of a term sheet, how a working capital calculation might be included, right? And so this is basically saying all assets are presented on a cash-free, debt-free basis with a working capital balance. In this case, it was $2.4 million. You can see the calculation here. And there were some adjustments there, which I'll walk you through in a second. And the calculation shall be determined accounts receivable minus accounts payable plus inventory, right? So in this case, there was not really any other current assets in either side of the coin or current liabilities, and so it was a very simple calculation. This business did have a little bit of noise, right? So one thing was they had some aged receivables of over 90 days that the seller still felt were collectible, but I agreed with weren't really fair to include in the working capital balance, which meant the business was holding more receivables than it would naturally hold. So what we did is said, hey, seller, you can keep those aged receivables and we will adjust them out of the working capital calculation. Similarly, the seller paid everything cash as soon as the bill was delivered, when in reality, they could probably set some 30 to 60 day payment terms. And so their AP was underrepresented. And so we gave them an adjustment for that as well. And then we added back in the inventory and we got to the working capital calculation. So this is how to think about the inclusion of working capital in a purchase price or a term sheet or a business valuation. It's a complex topic, but it doesn't have to be. The simple idea is just the business needs to have the assets, in this case, mostly accounts receivable and inventory, that come along with operating the company, and it keeps nefarious sellers in check and keeps the business, when you purchase it, as something that can actually produce the income that you're buying. So hopefully that helps you think about net working capital. Let me know what you think. Would love to hear your opinion and your perspective. And thank you for being a subscriber of the Deal Mastery Insider.